You're listening to episode 87 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David Loy joins us to talk about why Buddhism needs the West, studies in lack, and the selective evolutionary pressures on traditional practices. What happens when Buddhism, or any other traditional practice, encounters a new culture? It changes, grows, and finds new forms that suit the new environment in which it finds itself. The older environment may still exist, and the traditions suited to them will remain and continue to flourish as long as those cultures continue to flourish. Today, many religious practices are encountering a new culture, but unlike many such encounters in the past, contemporary culture is undergoing unprecedented, rapid, and constant change. For us as Buddhists, this is a good thing. Our practice is to see change, to understand that it is inevitable, that there is no benefit to relying on the false permanence of anything, let alone the manifestation of ever-changing minds. That's what culture may be seen as, the product of the minds of those within that society. There is a growing trend in modernity to secularism. There is a sincere and deep questioning of values and practices once held sacred. That does not, however, spell the end of Buddhism or any other religious tradition. It means, as Buddhism has done when it encountered any new time and place, adapting in form while keeping the essence of the practice strongly supporting its core objective, the extinguishing of suffering. David Robert Loy is a professor, writer, and Zen teacher in the Sambo Kyodan tradition of Japanese Zen Buddhism. He is a prolific author, and his books include The World is Made of Stories, Awareness, Bound and Unbound, Buddhist Essays, and the very popular Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes from Buddhist Revolution. His articles appear regularly in the pages of major journals such as Tikkun and Buddhist magazines including Tricycle, Turning Wheel, Shambhala Sun, and Buddha Dharma, as well as in a variety of scholarly journals. He's on the editorial or advisory boards of the journals Cultural Dynamics, Worldviews, Contemporary Buddhism, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and World Fellowship of Buddhist Review. He's also on the advisory boards of Buddhist Global Relief, the Clear View Project, and the Ernest Becker Foundation. David lectures nationally and internationally on various topics, focusing on the encounter between Buddhism and modernity, what each can learn from the other. He's especially concerned about social and ecological issues. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice clouds and mist green tea. And my guest today is David Loy. David, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Ted.
As we were speaking a little bit about before we started recording, there are a number of books that you've written. What I'd like to start with, though, is telling us about your background and how you encountered Buddhism.
Sure. Well, I'm part of that huge cohort that got into Buddhism in the late 60s and early 70s. One of many, many. And for me, it was through a number of things. My major in college was philosophy, and people come to philosophy from two sides, either the mathematical, logical side or the humanistic. And for me, it was the humanistic. And I spent a year studying British analytic philosophy in London, King's College there, which taught me that I wasn't interested in British analytic and pushed me more in the direction of existentialism, people like Nietzsche, Heidegger. And it's actually not such a big jump from, say, some of the things, some of the later Heidegger essays and things like D.T. Suzuki, Alan Watts, and so forth. For me, the big jump, well, of course, was from being a kind of nightstand philosophical reading Buddhist to actually being a practitioner, and that happened in Hawaii about 1971. After college, for me, it was '69, very much the height of the Vietnam War. I became a draft resister, moved out to San Francisco. But as that wound down, I decided to work on myself, and I was going to travel around the world. But I first stop was Hawaii, and I never got any further because I didn't have any money.
Funny how that inhibits
That
travel
place really
plans.
sucked, actually, yes, and it worked out very well. So there, eventually, I was hanging out with a friend in Waikiki. He heard about a Zendo near the university, Kokuan. So we went there to sit, and it's actually a bit of an interesting story. It's not necessarily the way I recommend people begin, but we at the end of the sitting, as we were having tea together, the people there mentioned that there was going to be a sesshin, a 7-day sesshin with a Zen master from Japan starting the following weekend. And my friend and I looked at each other and we said, "Cool, can we come?" And we had no idea what a sesshin was. And the fellow who said, "Well, I think we have a few places," he didn't really know what he was getting us into. Any case, we we did come to the session and survived it barely. I
7 days
literally
is your
I was
first
going crazy.
experience.
The fourth day or so, fifth day maybe, I because I hadn't sat very much before, I thought that I didn't have any perspective on these thoughts and feelings that were bouncing out of my head off the wall. And I actually remember deciding at that point that if I didn't feel better afterwards, I made a mistake, gone crazy, and I was going to go home and kill myself. But in fact, the after the session was over, there was a party, and it was a wonderful party, and a lot of that tension dissipated, and something happened soon thereafter, some tiny experience which just was enough to confirm for me that this this was my path, and so that was the beginning of the practice. By the way, my friend, I don't think he ever sat again. So,
And by sat again, you mean he's never sat down even in a chair again. That could happen after a 7 day as your introductory.
well, actually, we've lost touch. I would dearly love to see him again, but uh, it's a long time ago, so I don't expect that to happen. But in my case, I did keep the connection with Kokoan, with Yamada Koen Roshi, and also Robert Aiken, who was just starting to teach at that time. So one thing led to another. I was doing a lot of sitting in my own, continued sesshin, and eventually Robert Aiken invited me to the Maui Zendo. So that was basically how it started.
Okay. Now, from that, over the years, you have had something of an interest in how Buddhism is impacted by and impacts the culture of the contemporary West.
Hmm.
If you would tell us about what do you think some of the big opportunities for Buddhism in the West might be?
Well, I think there's really important opportunities on both sides. Um, well, for those of us in the West, unless we're really living in some very strange cave or keeping our eyes and ears closely shut, I think it's becoming more and more obvious that we're in a time of really grave crisis. And I think a lot of that crisis has to do with a very inadequate worldview. And what's exciting about Buddhism is that I think Buddhism can offer some very different perspectives that can help give us what I think we need at this point, especially attitudes toward the self. a different understanding of what the self is. Um, but also from the side of Buddhism too. I mean, Buddhism, um, it's it has a great variety of forms, as you know, and it's always changed quite dramatically every time it's gone to a different culture. Buddhism is the first of the three big missionary religions, but it spread in a rather, as far as we can tell, a relatively non-violent way by interacting with the local cultures, interacting with local gods, and so forth. And that meant that it was changed as much as it changed the culture. And so now Buddhism, this pre-modern uh, tradition, which has a lot of magical overlay to it, now it encounters, and I think it's begun what will have to be its greatest transition ever as it comes to a West at the height of its power and influence, but also a West that I think is very challenged and is really stuck and needs new ways of thinking, needs new practices if it's going to if we as a civilization are going to survive and thrive the next few centuries.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about some of this in your book, and it's one of the most popular books you've written, and I recently saw this on the shelves at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. Your book, Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes for a Buddhist Revolution. It's not popular just because it has the word sex in it. It's not it. There are some very interesting things you have to say about that, and I think what you're referring to about, and in particular the subtitle Notes for a Buddhist Revolution, is impacting some of those cultural norms, those views that we have as challenges and opportunities in where we are and in the circumstance we're in. Tell us a little bit about that book in particular.
Well, actually, a lot of the book is, from my side, not new material. It's an attempt to present in a more accessible way things that I've written about in a rather more academic, or at least certainly more philosophical way in some earlier things like lack and transcendence and my first book on non-duality. But the basic argument, the reason that I wanted to write a book like that is I felt the basic points, the basic argument was important, and therefore it needed to sort of get out to a more general, more public audience so that people would have a chance to reflect on it. The book consists of a number of short essays, which could also be understood orally as kind of Dharma talks, and I've sometimes presented them in that way. But the foundational one that I start with is a particular way of understanding what Buddhism is saying about the lack of self. And it seems to me that if we had to pick out the most essential or fundamental teaching of the Buddhism, of the Buddha, it's the way that he links dukkha, or suffering in the very broadest sense, with this delusive sense of separate self. In contemporary terms, we can say that the sense of self is a psychological and social construct. But because it's a construct, it's, I believe, inherently uncomfortable, inherently insecure. And that's what I think dukkha points to clearly when the Buddha emphasizes that there's this dukkha. I think that's the most fundamental type of dukkha, which certainly applies just as much to us today as it did to people in the Buddha's day.
Yeah, our conceptualization about things that we take for granted as being true and solid, unique, monolithic entities like self. That's the most core kind of example of that, because they're not real. They are references. They're convenient references. It doesn't mean that we don't have a conventional self, that it's not Ted and David speaking to each other. Of course that's there. But if we really, really attach to a permanent, unchanging self, rather than seeing that this is a social engagement, there are processes going on here, and when we run into issues and challenges with dukkha, with suffering, that perspective of process helps us to get a little bit of elbow room in those moments and extinguish that suffering because of our attachment to concepts and references that factually may not be quite as accurate as we think.
Mm-hmm. I really like your use of the word process because I think that's exactly right. Everything that we can identify of ourselves is not something fixed or substantial, but it's in process. It's impermanent, as the Buddha and Buddhism emphasizes. And the problem, I think, is that there's this side of us that doesn't want to be processed. It wants to be something more substantial, more real. And I think for many of us, our whole lives become uh, attempts to substantialize ourselves, attempts to make ourselves feel more real, to give this inevitably ungrounded and ungroundable and this sense of self which lacks any fixed identity, uh, to give this sense of self some reality that it can't really have.
Right. We have an inclination of contentedness with an idea of a self that I will go on. I'll have a rebirth. I will be born again in heaven, that I'm always me, that doesn't change regardless of what happens. And
Mm,
really, what I always see is the most fundamental and insightful opportunities with a Buddhist outlook is that instead of finding contentedness in uh, that misguided sense of self, that we can instead shift towards contentedness with understanding that this is process.
mm.
And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
One way I found helpful to try to express this lack of substantial self is to say that the sense of self is normally shadowed or haunted by a sense of lack. The feeling, insofar as we feel that we should be real, we also feel that there's something that interferes with that's keeping that from happening. And I think the way we usually become conscious of it is we feel there's something particular that we lack. And so often that's projected outside ourselves. Certainly, our culture encourages us to do that. We think, if only I had enough of that, especially something like money or fame,
Mm-hmm.
or if only I could resolve this problem that's out here, then everything will be okay and I'll be happy. And I think what Buddhism is really getting at is saying, well, no, it's something about the nature of an unawakened mind to be bothered by something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because two of the books that you've written, and I think these two were published fairly close to each other. One is titled Lack and Transcendence: The Problem of Death and Life in Psychotherapy,
Mhm.
Existentialism, and Buddhism. And another book is A Buddhist History of the West: Studies in Lack. So you've
Mhm.
had the word lack in both of those, and I was going to ask you about that anyway. So, in particular, with A Buddhist History of the West, uh, again, I think this is essays that you've done on this particular topic. Tell us a little bit more about that, this concept of lack.
Right. Well, the Buddhist history of the West is a kind of sequel to the previous one, the lack and transcendence. So let me start with that one a bit. It had a kind of interesting genesis that there was a time when I was living in Kamakura doing a lot of Zen practice with my teacher there. And a number of things happened. My father, who had been in the my father, who had been very healthy, suddenly was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And also, soon thereafter, my Zen teacher uh, became very ill, bedridden, and eventually died. And I was basically not only sitting a lot, but reading everything I could about mortality and death. And I was particularly struck by Ernest Becker, an existential psychologist who wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Denial of Death, and also an unfinished book, Escape from Evil. Both of them very wonderful, and both of them emphasizing how much in our daily lives we are preoccupied with denying our mortality. And I felt this was very powerful. That he was really onto something. That unlike what Freud said, our primary repression isn't sexual desires, especially not now in this culture, but rather our inability to accept our mortality. But from a Buddhist perspective, it's just a little bit different, I think. If you think about mortality, it's worrying about what's going to happen to us in the future, inevitably. Whereas I think the Buddhist emphasis on emptiness and lack of self is really pointing out something more immediate, that we're not real right now, and there's something terrifying about that we can't cope with. And then that leads to what I was saying, that we, in largely unconscious and symbolic ways, we become preoccupied with trying to find some way to make ourselves feel more real, more substantial.
Hmm. Yeah, and the hindrance that fascinates me most of the five is the restlessness and worry, and this idea that we have it's casting your mind in the past or the future.
Mm.
These are our sources of restlessness and worry, that in the present moment we don't have that overriding possibility of restlessness and worry because we're right now. And so these ideas of in 5 years, my Alzheimer's will kick in, and that will be a drain on my loved ones, and I will suffer, and all that. Right now, right now, we're sitting and engaging in good conversation or whatever it is, and even when it's a less than positive present moment, when it's a very bad present moment, there are still things that we are able to do perfectly naturalistically in our practice to calm our minds, to be able to successfully and positively engage with whatever that moment brings.
If it's true that the sense of self is a construct that's shadowed by a sense of lack, then I suspect that also explains why we find it so difficult to live in the present. Because to live in the present is to feel that sense of lack usually. And I think that's why it's so difficult for people, especially at the beginning, to meditate.
Yes.
To meditate well means to give up our preoccupation, our fantasies, not only with the past, but especially with the future. In a way, I think this even explains our preoccupation with the future, that we need time, we need the future, because for us, that's when everything's going to become okay, when our projects to make ourselves real are going to be fulfilled, and then we can, and then we'll be okay. Then everything will be all right. So often we live so much of our lives not now, but fantasizing about what's going to happen. Or on the other side, if we find that our projects are stymied and we lose our projects for making ourselves more real, then feeling depressed and anxious right now, as you just said.
Yeah, and these are the narratives of our lives, and what we try to do is gain some form of sustenance and encouragement from them without attaching to them. Your sequel to Lack and Transcendence is a Buddhist history in the West. So let's hear about that, because that's also studies in lack.
Right. Well, it occurred to me that if it's true that the sense of self is a construct and it's always shadowed by a sense of lack, that this has historical implications as well. Not only that the construct will be somewhat different in different times and places. Certainly, there's enormous differences between pre-modern and postmodern people, but also that the way that we understand our sense of lack will be different in different times. And so what that collection of essays explores is some of the different ways in which our sense of lack has been experienced. And in particular, of course, there's a lot of reference to Christianity, since the book is primarily about the West or Western Europe. How, of course, for people living, say, 1,000 years ago, a peasant in France, for example, they would have a socially agreed, socially acceptable way of understanding what their sense of lack is. It's that they've sinned. They not only their own sins, but the original sin they inherit from Adam and Eve, and whether we think it's a good way or not. The point is, their culture would give them a way to address that sense of lack.
Right.
You have confession, absolution, communion, penances, and so forth, and at least the promise that if you behave yourself, even if everything else goes wrong, that you'll be happy in heaven afterwards, if you do everything that the church says, and so forth. In fact, it occurs to me, this is a real speculation, but I wonder how much uh, religion can be understood historically as our usual way collectively of trying to address the sense of lack. If sense of lack is inherent to self-consciousness, it, it's an interesting question how much um, that would lie at the origins of religion, or certainly one of the main origins. But even more interesting to me is the modern predicament. You can have a secular society, a very modern society such as we have now, which doesn't accept those sorts of religious explanations, and yet we still have a sense of lack. But the normal culture doesn't have a place for it. Doesn't. I mean, we're not the kinds of cultural conditioning that we're exposed to uh, don't presuppose that and don't really give us any way of dealing with it. Our present culture doesn't understand or acknowledge that we have a sense of lack. It doesn't give us the traditional collective religious ways of understanding it, at least not for many, modern people who don't accept religious fundamentalism anymore. But we still have the sense of lack. What so how does that play out? And this is where I think it helps us understand why it is that consumerism is so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a void we're trying to fill, for example, is one possibility.
Exactly.
And this is one of the issues that we have in more religious conservative views have a finger to point about, but there's you people who are atheists, for example, may be lacking in a fundamental spiritual fulfillment, and the words and the social context in which they use the terms are ones to which those of us who are uh, scientific reductionists and atheists may not incline towards. So we have a challenge of speaking different languages, for one thing. But
Sure.
really, it comes down to what do we find. I think it could be wrong in this. For me, it's a matter of what do we find inspiring, what do we find fulfilling, what gets us to a point of being content with the circumstances as they are. And we may, for example, have a great inspiration and interest in science, and it's very visceral for us, and we get excited by that, and we're intrigued by what the future may hold. And yet, that's a very different thing than what a religious offering may be. And so, how that kind of fulfillment occurs in a more secular society, I'm not sure where that's going. It's an interesting question because I don't know that the secular society, for example, would even agree that there is something to fulfill.
hmm Well, maybe it's worth mentioning here that I find the usual conception, the usual understanding of secular society somewhat puzzling and problematical to me. I mean, so often we understand our world as the secular world, that that's simply that the way things are. It's the way the world is when you remove superstitious, magical, religious kinds of overlays. Um, whereas it seems to me that the concept of the secular isn't simply what is, but it itself is historically conditioned. And in some problematical ways, with the Protestant Reformation, which really lies at the root of modernity, there came a very strong split between the transcendental and the temporal, or the sacred and this secular world, much stronger than it was previously, because, of course, during the era of the Universal Catholic Church, everyday life was permeated with rituals, with permeated with the sacred. But thanks to Luther and Protestantism, there was more of a split. And what's happened was, as God receded up into the clouds and eventually disappeared into the heavens, we were left with the secular world. But I think Nietzsche expressed this very well. The result of the Reformation was that there was this duality between this secular world and the sacred, but such that each was understood only in relation to the other. So, with the disappearance or the diminution of the role of the sacred, we have a rather devalued and I think maybe not clearly understood world that's been left to us.
Well, it sounds like part of the concept here is that there's a mutual dependency of white. You need a black to really give white its full value, but the two have only the distinction of color or lack of color in common. That otherwise they're really quite different facing propositions. And we have that with the secular and the spiritual, at least in what I'm getting out of the statement from Nietzsche, is that there is this association. They're facing different ways. And I have the image of two people, arms crossed, facing different ways, but they're wearing the same belt. They can't get away from each other.
Well, one way to say it, the sacred traditionally was the source of all meaning and value. And therefore, with the disappearance of the sacred, what we were left with was a kind of devalued secular world. And I think we're still in the early stages of the process of trying to reevaluate it, as Nietzsche says, or of really trying to understand what it is without seeing it as simply the shadow or the just one half of the duality.
Now, since we're speaking of the world, one of the things I did want to chat about is your most recent book, written in 2010, which is The World is Made of Stories. That's a very interesting title because the subject of stories and our narratives and how they really play into what makes up our world has been a topic that has come up a great deal in online conversations and blog posts and even sometimes on the podcast. Tell us about this book and what your overriding theme is, why you chose that particular title.
Right. Well, you're certainly correct that I think the question of narrative and the role of stories in our lives has certainly become a hot topic in the last, well, maybe we can say even the last generation. It's not an easy book to talk about. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. It has a very unusual sort of structure. It's composed about equally of little sort of statements by me, short paragraphs, sometimes only a sentence or two. That's about half of it. And the other half is quotations from an enormous variety of people. And the challenge of the book is that the reader really needs to put it together. There is, in fact, unlike what some reviewers have said, there is, in fact, a golden thread that runs through the whole, but it's a little bit like a koan that you yourself have to think about what you're reading and and you yourself have to think about what you're reading and how the different bits fit together. One way to understand the book is that it's an attempt to present the Dharma in a very different sort of vocabulary. One of the sources of the book is this question: does Buddhist practice involve getting rid of stories, or rather finding the correct story? Is that what the Dharma presents us, the correct story, and once we identify with that, then everything is okay? Or is it perhaps something different, that Buddhism practice gives us insight into how storying works? So rather than either identifying with one particular story or seeing the practice as getting rid of all stories, can we thereby gain a kind of freedom from understanding the way storying works, so that we don't need to identify, but nor do we need to get rid, but rather we're liberated to dance with stories, to play with them, to realize that different stories are appropriate, that there are often different ways to say things, different ways to do things, and rather than needing to, as I said, either identify with one or get rid of them altogether.
For those who are listening, in the Secular Buddhist under About, there is a link for Secular Buddhism Guiding Principles. And what you were just talking about speaks to one of the values that we put in there, and it was secular Buddhism values the stories of Buddhist traditions
Mm,
uh, as metaphorical expressions of meaningful and practical lessons. That the idea here being that, as you had said, this is a way of dancing with the stories, of engaging with them, that they don't need to be literally true or literally false. It's how we engage with what they're saying that the true meaning of these can present themselves. And it's going to vary based on who we are. What are the circumstances? This is an entirely different environment. It's going to take a different shape.
mm. Exactly. Although I would add to that, I think it's not that it's a question of neither true nor false, but it gives us a rather different perspective on what it means for something to be true and what it means for something to be false. I recently came across a wonderful quotation from John Berger. I think it comes from his novel G. Let's see if I can. Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one. Wow. Wow. So, and of course, this ties up very much with the the coming together of Buddhism in the West. What about the Buddhist stories? Which of those cultural stories can we understand as so historically conditioned that they don't really work for us anymore, that we don't need them? And what are the essential stories that are essential for the kind of liberation that Buddhism works toward? How are we going to understand that liberation today? All of this can be understood in story terms, especially because, of course, the sense of self is constructed largely out of stories, that the most important parts of our own identity are the stories that we tend to identify with. What does it mean to be a Buddhist? You can say for some people it involves identifying with a certain set of propositions, but I expect for more Buddhists it's stories about the life of the Buddha and the fact that he's an exemplar in certain ways of our condition and how it is that we addressed our condition.
Now, you've recently moved. You're now in Boulder, and you're at Naropa Institute. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, that's right. I have a fellowship here with Naropa Institute, and it's not. It doesn't involve teaching, but while I'm here, I'm going to be writing another book, which basically deals with the issues that I'm always concerned about: the great conversation or dialogue between Buddhism and modernity. And in this case, I'm going to try to give an overview of some of the things that have been happening. There will be a chapter on psychology because I think that's such an exciting. In fact, you could really say that that's the probably the area where Buddhism has had the most impact, rather than religion or Christianity, something like that. We have so many Western therapists now, many of whom are not only Buddhist practitioners but also actually Buddhist teachers. And although it's very early days, it's clear that Buddhism is going to have an enormous impact on the whole discipline of psychotherapy.
And study of even just the brain, let alone mind itself. That's why I have a number of episodes interviewing people who are doing these studies under scientific controlled circumstances about what's going on in the brain for the self-reporting of meditators for particular sense of receptivity of pain or sense of well-being or things like that. It's wide open right now and wonderful to see that growth.
Again, very early stages. It's too early to get a very clear sense, but it's clearly one of the cutting edges of our culture. This is from perhaps the last book called Awareness Bound and Unbound, or one of the last books. There's a collection of essays, and there's one called Terrorism is Religion, which talks a bit about, a variety of things, but one of the things it talks about is secularism. And this is where the basic argument, I think, is that if secularism doesn't acknowledge or isn't able to acknowledge that we have this sense of lack, then it's going to become quite problematical. Let me just read a couple sentences to you here and just see if this makes any sense. A metaphorical understanding of the spiritual makes it more obvious that the sacred can't be avoided, although it can be repressed if we accept a diminished understanding of ourselves to accommodate our diminished understanding of the world. It's easy to dismiss the outdated beliefs and antiquated rituals of traditional religions, while missing the fact that these are expressions, however unsatisfactory today, of a basic human orientation to sacralize the world one lives in, including integrating practices that address one's sense of lack. The secular world is secular only in relation to a particular kind of subject, which understands its lack in a particular way, or more precisely, often does not understand its lack in a way that helps to successfully resolve it. The deep-rooted anxiety that accompanies life in a rationalized world, which deprives us of the spiritual identity that traditionally served to ground us, is not some accident of modern history. Metaphysical terror is implicit in the basic figure-ground relationship that secularized humans have with their secularized world. The secular world is deficient in the sense that we don't experience the world as it really is, but as distorted perceptually and emotionally by our repressed, unacknowledged need to find something in it that will fill up the gaping wound at our core. Obsessed with the emptiness of a God-shaped hole that our rationality can't understand and so doesn't recognize, we now try to make ourselves real by making the best of the possibilities that the secular world offers, which means that individually we're obsessed with symbolic reality projects such as money, fame, and power. Collectively, our lack empowers transnational corporations that are never big or profitable enough, nation states that are never secure enough, and accelerating technological innovation that's never innovative enough to satisfy us for very long. Insofar as these preoccupations are driven by a compulsion to fill up a lack they cannot fulfill, they tend to become addictive and demonic. In short, this is the last sentence. We don't understand what's unique about the secular world without also acknowledging the unique identity crisis haunting the people who live in that world. By liberating us from the more confining identities of the past, modernity also has liberated our lack. And secularity implies that we can seek a solution to that lack only by identifying with something in the world. This is really trying to give a critique. I don't know whether you want to call it a critique of secularity or a critique of the way that most people live in a secular world. Maybe one can make that distinction, but did that make any sense as I was reading it to you?
That made perfect sense. What you're talking about directly here, and as you're reading it, is this is what I see as the biggest challenge we face with having a secular proposition, is that there is a tendency, which I think we can get out of, to identify secularity only with things that are not personally uplifting to us in a spiritual sense. And I don't mean spiritual in the Casper way. I don't mean in anything that is in any way unnatural. I mean that secularism, even if it does not functionally have that, as many secularists would attest, there is still the shade of meaning that secularism is devoid of passion, of visceral engagement as an emotional thinking human being. And I find that to be just not so. But I'm rather unique in that because as a secularist, I'm also someone who has a very active and passionate Buddhist practice. And that has me very much in the minority in some of the communities in which I am otherwise thriving, is that is a very odd concept.
Why would you want to meditate? Right. What's the point?
Yes,
right.
What's the point? If this is just the placebo effect, you might as well just take a good vacation, are the kinds of things that I hear. And I understand that point of view as a skeptic. I do want to question that and have done the practice myself. So the idea of what does chocolate taste like? Well, I know. I've had chocolate. And it's great. And the idea that I shouldn't like chocolate or I should like dark over milk chocolate is nonsensical. This is entirely based on an individual preference. And I can now happily, due to many of these studies, point to scientific controlled studies where we do see a difference in just the physical composition of the brain, in some of the different kinds of waves that the brain is giving off during meditation versus people who are in a control that are not meditating. And there are valid criticisms of well, how are we controlling for all the factors in this? Well, you never can when you have human subjects. So that's a very legitimate concern. And certainly more study will help to further refine that. It's also very expensive. Doing an fMRI is it's not cheap. So yes, it's a very narrow group. We may have 15 to 20 subjects instead of 10,000. I'd much rather have 10,000. I think that would be a terrific study to see what that reveals. That may be a long way off, though. And seeing that in the meantime, until we have that sort of thing, from personal experiences, you and I and people who have been long-term meditators may be able to share their experiences that show that one can have perhaps even a secular practice that is nonetheless filling that gap which we as human beings share.
Thinking generally or broadly about what you're saying helps me connect it with the sort of next book project that I have, which I've already pretty much researched. But looking at, what can we say, the evolution, cultural evolution from a Buddhist perspective, or the evolution of religious paradigms from a religious Buddhist perspective. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the axial age.
Yes, oh, absolutely. You had Buddha and Confucius and a couple of other folks who were the key thinkers of that age.
It's actually very hard to find good studies of that because to do a really good job, you have to be an expert in so many different fields and cultures. But what I think is fascinating is the axial age was indeed a turning point, and a lot of that turning point had to do with a stronger sense of transcendence, and connected with that, a stronger transcendent demand for us to change, both individually and collectively. That, prior to the axial age, there's a kind of embeddedness. The kings are also the high priests. They're the ones who relate to the gods. But with the axial age, we all have a relationship to the God. So the positive side of that was this personal demand. Well, like we see in Buddhism, for example, the possibility of transforming yourself, especially by transforming your motivations and being more aware of how your mind works. This encouragement to do so. And also collectively, it took a more collective version, I think, in Greece with beginnings of democracy and so forth. But what I find is fascinating is the downside of the axial age, of course, is a much stronger sense of duality, given that the transcendental demand comes from some other supposed reality, God or heaven or whatever. Inevitably, there's a tendency to devalue this world, and therefore that's the duality that we've been struggling against for so long until, and even into a large extent now with the modern world. And so the challenge, I think, right now is a sense of spirituality or religiosity that doesn't require that kind of duality. One thing I'm working a lot on is looking at evolution and what's going on with the evolutionary process, and whether to some extent Buddhism can help us give us a different perspective, help us to bridge this enormous gap between science and spirituality, which is otherwise so invidious and self-defeating. Anyway, sorry, I probably told you more than you want to know, but
no, you're preaching to the choir, because the very language you're using of evolution is near and dear to my heart, and I see it this way, and I always feel a little bit off in the corner that not a lot of folks seem to think of it this way, that our cultural environment, I equate that often with a physical biological environment, and that our memes, to borrow from Sue Blackmore, they are things that evolve based on the conditions, based on the selective pressures put upon them. When you were talking initially about the axial age, I was thinking it's not so much that here's this age and this time, and poof, you had the great thinkers of the axial age showed up out of nowhere, and it was an amazing thing. I don't necessarily adhere to that as a concept. I suspect that there was a natural and inevitable evolutionary production of a representative branch of that evolutionary tree of thought. That was something that had to occur due to the selective pressures of that cultural environment of that time. And right now what we're seeing, and I think this is what you're saying the same thing, is that we've had this duality. We've had, for example, Buddhism has been, I think, hindered by the Brahmanic concept of rounds of rebirth and continued life is something to escape. That we reside in the current moment to see that it is inherently empty, that sunyata, that there's nothing here that we perceive of as a permanent thing that's really of value. The things that we grasp onto are valueless, that they're not real things at all. And that has been going through an evolution along with Buddhism, along with that area of the geographic sphere of how people engage with living in Zen. We see that has shifted a bit to a meditation on the refinement of the beauty of the moment. And we see this in the poetry, in particular, I think, of the Zen tradition of Ryokan and Issa and the other great poets of that time. And that's a very different, a wholly different facing way of looking at that engagement with the moment. And I think now we're in a next evolutionary cycle, and to go a little geeky on evolution, this is punctuated equilibrium. There's been a stability for several hundred years. Now we're hitting a spot where things are changing drastically enough that we're going to see new forms evolving at a very rapid rate.
It's interesting. Two comments on what you just said. First of all, a lot of that shift has to do with the move from India to China, to East Asia, because, of course, they had a much less negative attitude towards samsara. But just going back to the origins of the Axial Age, it seems pretty clear it had a lot to do with the evolution of script, the invention of script, which had certain... it's a complicated story, but I find it pretty persuasive. And of course, what's fascinating is modernity occurs when we get print. Luther is successful in part because of Gutenberg and the ability to get his word out there, but also that print involves a number of psychological and social consequences that I think help to create the modern world. And what do we do now with the digital and just think of the way we're communicating now and the this more audio-visual culture. It's still early days. What does it mean that, for someone like myself, growing up in the 60s, and in academia, so much of your time is involved with learning how to forage and find the information you need. And suddenly we're in a world where you can find virtually any fact or data you want within an instant. How does this change our consciousness? And I think it's still very early days, but clearly we're headed off into a brave new world.
It is, absolutely. And we've had this engagement and several times with different speakers on the podcast that there's the norm that a particular religious tradition may take a few hundred years to really get inculcated into a particular geographic location or environment. Right. We are no longer necessarily constrained by geographic location. We're no longer dependent on the monastery as the source of learning. And our the way that's shifting, and with increased literacy rates, the accessibility to information, to teaching, and to new ways of thinking about just our life as a human being, I think are going to have a very significant impact. And again, that's why I brought in punctuated equilibrium with a nod to Stephen Jay Gould, it's a very, you're in a time of upheaval, whether that's an environmental, biologically constrained time of upheaval, and creatures must adapt, and those that are better suited to those conditions thrive, and those that do not end up being the dead branches of the tree. I think we're going to have something very similar happening, not just in Buddhism, but in other religions, in other ways that people live moment by moment.
Yeah. I expect you're familiar with that famous quotation from H.G. Wells that history is a race between education and catastrophe.
I love H.G. Wells.
And, and but and I think it's very true, especially if we understand education in the broadest sense, as including the Dharma. And what I think is happening is both are accelerating. It's a good thing. It's not going to take us 300 years because I'm not sure we have 300 years.
I agree. In particular, issues with climate and
exactly. Yeah.
that we have such divisiveness over people's understandable non-comprehension of the difference between climate and weather. I'm concerned. I did an interview with Eugenie Scott from the National Center for Science Education, and they are the folks who combat creationism being taught in schools. Well, they've recently started engaging in the climate change denialists. And Jeannie had a terrific presentation in which she showed this one climate statistic. It was a chart that said, "Oh, but actually, things have been getting cooler in this period, and that's just so this is not true." And then she broadened the view of that one sliver of data, and you saw that it was an anomalous jump that was for one short few week period, but that the overall trend has been very, very clear and incontrovertible. There's no getting around it. And it concerned me that there are people who had all of the data, who saw the full trend, and for whatever reason, and this is what I'm most curious about, were perfectly willing to disingenuously cook the books about what it showed. And like, don't you also live on this planet? Don't you also have family and friends and children? Are you really that tied to, big oil or whatever the particular financial institution it is that may suffer with our non-adherence to fossil fuels? Can't we change that? Can't we find better answers?
If I had to pick the fundamental problem, and maybe we can call this the fundamental problem of secularism as it's normally understood, is again, going back to this sense of separation, which implies not only that I'm different from you, but that I can pursue my own well-being quite apart from the well-being of you, and not at the cost of your well-being. And I think that's what's most terrifying at this particular point, that we have institutionally rationalized and encouraged that process that we understand. That our well-being can be separated in those ways because we're separate in those ways, and sometimes I think that the challenge of climate change right now is the Earth is telling us, grow up or get out of the way. If we continue to try to address it in the old way of, I'm going to try to get you to do the maximum so I can do the minimum, then I'll benefit more. And as long as we approach the problem in those terms of my best interests are still separate from your best interest, we're going to all go flaming down together. It's pretty clear. And so the challenge is whether the kind of non-duality, the realization, the experience of non-duality, whether people can have that deeply enough, whether somehow that can also become embedded and play a role in our institutions. That I see is the real challenge, the sort of fundamental one, which to me is, how I understand spirituality. It doesn't have any reference to some other God realm, but it does have to do with the denial of this sense of separation between us, which is the fundamental delusion as far as I can see.
And I think that's part of what Stephen Batchelor has called in his description of the opportunities with secular Buddhism, is that this is to inspire a culture of awakening.
Yes, I love that phrase.
Yeah. It is. And he said, I haven't used that as much lately, but really the idea here is that our practice isn't about just what happens on the cushion or what we feel inside the privacy of our own heads, but how we're engaging with others, and not just that we're smiling and happy. It's not that. It's where do we take things right now for this world and where we're going, which is one reason I tend to shift my focus more towards this lifetime and not so much on discussions of what may happen in a future life or other heavens or other realms, I am sure that I am living in this one, and that my loved ones are living in this one, and that the actions I take and the way I engage with this one impacts them. And that's why that has to be, at least for me, my primary focus.
I may be more agnostic than you or most of your friends, but regarding future lifetimes. What I think is important is for me to live in such a way that it doesn't make any difference.
So for people who are listening, if you'd like to find out more, you can go to David's website at www.davidloy.org. That's DAVIDLOY.org. David, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.